It may often be necessary for a server object to provide different privilege levels to different clients. For instance, if you have a file server, the file server may have different access privileges to different classes of users. And in order to facilitate that kind of differential invocation of objects, the security model that Spring provides is via what is called a front object. So this is the underlying object, and an underlying object may have a front object that is completely outside of the Spring semantics for object invocation. The connection between the front object and the underlying object is entirely within the purview of the implementer of the service. Or in other words, this connection is not through the door mechanism that I told you about that Spring system provides you. So all that the client domain is going to be able to do is access this front object, and the front object will register the door for accessing it with the nucleus so that the client can go through this door to this front object, and the front object is the one that is going to then check the access control list, ACL, in order to see what kind of privileges this client domain has in order to make an invocation on the underlying object. And it is possible to have multiple front objects to the underlying objects with distinct doors registered with the nucleus for different implementation of control policies that you want for a particular service. So in other words, the policies that you want for accessing the services available in an underlying object can be implemented in these front object or different instances of this front object depending on how many different control policies you want. So when a client invocation comes in through this door to the front object, the ACL, the access control list, is checked before allowing this invocation to actually go through to the underlying object. As I mentioned earlier, if this client domain has access to an invocation entry point in a server, that is, it has access to a door, the client domain can pass this around because it's a software capability, and the software capability can be passed around by the client domain to other domains in order to use that same capability to access the same object. But in so doing, the client domain can decide whether it wants to give the same privilege for accessing this object or lesser privilege than what it has. Those are the things that can be implemented as policies through this front object. For example, let's say that the user wants to print a file foo. The user, of course, has full access to the file system for this particular object, that is the file that the user has created. This is a reference to the object foo, and user has full access to that. But it wants to print the file, but it doesn't want to give privilege to the printer object any more privilege than it needs to have to print this. In particular, if I want to print a file, then all I need to do is give a one-time privilege to the printer object in order to print that file. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this capability that I've got for this file foo, reduce the privilege level, and say that you've got a reference to the same object, but you have a one-time reference. Now the printer object can access the file system and present its capability, and the front object, which is associated with the file system, will verify that yes, the one-time ticket that this guy has is not expended yet, and therefore it is allowed to access this file so that it can do its job of printing. But if it tries to present the same handle again, it will be rejected by the front object associated with the file system because this is a one-time reference. The capability that is being provided by the user to the printer is a one-time capability. So we've seen how object invocation can happen efficiently through the door mechanism and the thread handoff mechanism that I mentioned within a single node, and it can happen efficiently across the network through the proxies, and it can also happen securely by the fact that you can associate policies in front objects that govern access to the object. So these are all the mechanisms that are provided in the Spring kernel, and this is where the innovation happens. Or in other words, the external interface, even though it is a Unix operating system, under the cover, the Spring system does all of these innovations in terms of how to structure the operating system itself using object technology.